Hi, you're listening to Bonus Points, the official podcast of Mr. Astel's theology class. Join us as we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond.
Today, we're talking about Pope Michael, a man in Kansas who claims to be the real Pope. Let's begin. Welcome, everybody, to another episode 22 of Bonus Points. Before we begin, I just want to give a quick shout out to my friend Mike Creevy. Mike is the host of the Gracious Guest podcast, and he was kind enough to have me on his show last week. It was so much fun. As much as I love sitting here talking to myself, it was really nice to have that conversation. So I'm going to have a link to that episode of the Gracious Guest in the show notes. And Mike, Mr. Creevy, if you're listening to this, once again, thank you for having me on the show. This is a reminder for all of you. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen to it. Make sure you share it with somebody who you think might be interested. Check out our website, bonuspointspodcast.com, and especially get those questions in, because I'm hoping to do another episode of Question and Astel here in the next couple weeks. So if you head on over to bonuspointspodcast.com and click Ask a Question, that is your place to submit questions about, well, pretty much anything. I'm really excited about today's topic, Pope Michael, because it's one of those interesting things, right? There's a guy in Kansas who says he's the real Pope. And so if we're going to address his claims, that's going to be a good opportunity to talk about a movement called Sedevacantism, and we'll evaluate the claims that movement makes. We'll talk a little bit about the natural law and how the process of electing a pope works, again, to evaluate his claims to be the pope. And we'll even get a definition of a heretic. So this one seemingly random, absurd topic is actually going to be an opportunity to cover some important points, some bonus points. So let's start with, before we can get to Pope Michael specifically, he comes out of a movement called Sedevacantism. So understanding Sedevacantism is going to be critical to understanding Pope Michael. So what is that? What is Sedevacantism? You can tell it's made up of two parts, sede vacante, which means empty chair. Now, this is, the term sede vacante is usually used to refer to the time between popes. So you have the death, or in some cases resignation, of a pope. There's going to be a span of time before a new pope is elected. That in-between period is called sede vacante, or empty chair. What sedevacantists believe, and that's what makes this a distinct movement, is that they believe that we are currently in a state of sede vacante. They believe that there is not currently a valid pope. And in fact, most sedevacantist groups believe that we have not had a valid pope since the death of Pope Pius XII. They believe that every pope from John the 23rd until the current era has been a false pope. They've not been a valid pope. So in the minds of most sedevacantists, for the last 60 years, the church has been without a pope. So why would they say this? Obviously, there are going to be some variations. There are going to be different approaches, but the basic argument goes something like this. We're going to present the argument first, and then later in the episode, we'll come back to evaluate the claims that they make. But the argument made by sedevacantists is that a heretic cannot be pope, that if somebody becomes a heretic, they forfeit any ecclesiastical office they hold, including that of pope, and that somebody who is a heretic cannot validly be elected as a pope. So that's their first premise: a heretic cannot be pope. Their second premise is that all the popes since John the 23rd have been heretics, especially because of Vatican II. They're going to have a huge problem with Vatican II. In fact, many sedevacantist groups will claim that, they will claim that the documents of Vatican II contained heresy. And they will say, therefore, any bishop who signed any of the documents of Vatican II is therefore a heretic and has therefore forfeited office. This would include not only Pope John the 23rd, who opened the council, Pope Paul VI, who closed the council, but they would even include all the bishops who were present at the council who signed any of the documents, which, as you would expect, that's going to create some issues. Now, others will say they won't talk as much about the bishops themselves. Most Sedevacantists will point to Vatican II, but some will focus more specifically on the person of the Pope. So they'll look at, for example, statements that Pope John the 23rd made that they considered to be heretical and say, okay, well, therefore he was out. And there are some variations about what the specific heresies are. Most will say that the popes and bishops of Vatican II were guilty of some form of modernism, that they were trying to change the faith to align closer with modern ideals. But when you ask them to be more specific, there's going to be a lot of variation. And to be fair, there are some groups that have some nuance. They don't automatically say that every pope since Vatican II is invalid. But that's kind of the general idea, is that Sedevacantists believe that because of what they perceive to be heresy in the Second Vatican Council, the pope that opened it, as well as any pope since then, has been invalid. And so in their understanding, even though there is apparently a pope, there is somebody who claims to be the Bishop of Rome, currently Francis, they will say none of those have been real popes. We have not had a real pope since the death of Pope Pius XII, right before the Second Vatican Council. All right, how does that get us to Pope Michael? Well, Sedevacantists believe, like we said, that there's no pope, and that's a problem, right? The church is supposed to have a pope. Now, many Sedevacantist groups will kind of shrug and say, well, what are we supposed to do about it, you know? There was one group in Kansas, though, that said, let's try being the solution here. We can do something about that. And so this is in the late 80s, leading up to 1990, they find every Sedevacantist group they can. They check all these directories of traditionalist priests who they think reject Vatican II or reject the Pope or both. And so they they send out hundreds of information packets to pretty much every Sedevacantist they can find. And they're saying, hey, we all agree there's no Pope, but let's elect one. And they said, we're going to hold a conclave. And they don't get much of a response. But we'll get to that. First, let's define our terms a little bit. They say they're going to hold a conclave. Now, if you have taken my church course, especially sophomores and juniors this year, you've heard the term conclave. We talked about conclave. We had our own, but not that kind, not the kind to elect an anti-pope, just for fun. So the conclave refers to the process of electing a pope. It's called that. The word conclave means with key, and it refers to the fact that under the current procedure, the cardinals are locked in the Sistine Chapel. So ordinarily, it's the College of Cardinals that elects the Pope, at least those cardinals who are younger than age 80. Here's the problem, at least for Sedevacantist groups. They believe that any bishop or cardinal that signed the documents of Vatican II forfeited office because that meant they were becoming a heretic. So what that means is that for Sedevacantists, at the end of Vatican II, there's only one cardinal left, and that's Cardinal Mindszenty, and he dies in 1975. So as this Sedevacantist group is preparing, they're trying to fix the problem. They're trying to get a pope when they claim we haven't had a pope. They look around and they say, well, technically there are no valid cardinals. And that's a problem because normally the pope is elected by cardinals. So what are they going to do? Well, the group that's trying to put this conclave together cites the natural law, which, again, if you've taken morality, you recognize that term, natural law. The law that is written on our hearts, the law that even is accessible to those who do not know the faith, just kind of the right and wrong that we all know. Well, they cite the natural law, which says that a society can always provide itself with a ruler. And they say, well, the church is the perfect society, so therefore the church can always provide itself with its ruler, with its pope, even in the absence of cardinals. And so they say, why, yes, it is true that cardinals ordinarily elect the pope. We are in extraordinary circumstances because there are no cardinals. Therefore, the church has the power to elect a pope by going outside of the normal procedure. All right, so how do you get from that to this random group of lay people in Kansas? Well, they are going to cite another principle, and that's the principle of first in time, first in right. In other words, if you have two candidates who both claim to be elected the Pope, which one was elected first? That's the valid Pope. So they take these two principles. Number one, that a society always has the ability to elect, it always has the ability to have a ruler, which in this case comes through election. So the first principle, a society can always find a ruler. And number two, first in time, first in right. In other words, nobody else has thought to have a conclave since we've been in this period of Sedevacantism. Therefore, whoever we elect will be the Pope. And if there are groups that have a problem with that, they should have held their own conclave sooner. And if you're hearing that and thinking, well, that seems like a curious line of reasoning, that there seems to be some weaknesses there. There are, don't worry, we'll get to those in a few minutes. But that's their reasoning anyway, and that's how you end up with this conclave being held in 1990. So the Sedevacantist group in Kansas, they say, we're going to hold a conclave, and they genuinely believe that they're going to elect the real Pope. That the Pope, the apparent Pope in Rome is not the Pope, which at that time would have been John Paul II. They say, we are going to hold a conclave to resolve this Sedevacantist crisis, and because we're the first ones doing this, our candidate will be the Pope. They write to every Sedevacantist and traditionalist group they can get a hold of and send information packets saying, hey, we're going to hold a conclave. I think at the end of the day, they sent out over 200 information packets to different bishops and groups throughout the world. And all of that comes together on July 16th, 1990, when all of these electors come together. It was a group of 6 lay people. They elected Dave Bowden, who took the name Pope Michael I. And it's worth mentioning here, of the 6 lay people who held this conclave, obviously Dave was one of them. His mom and dad were also there. So that means between Pope Michael and his parents, that's fully half of the electors. So take that for what it's worth. But before we address the claims made by the Sedevacantist movement, and especially by Pope Michael specifically, let's talk about this guy. So Dave Bowden, born in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma in 1959, which was slightly before the council. He grew up during the Second Vatican Council. And then in 1975, his family started attending an SSPX chapel. Now, we could have a whole episode on the SSPX, and we might at some point. But just the quick version, SSPX stands for the Society of St. Pius X. This is a traditionalist movement, which means it is a group, in this case, a group of priests who reject the Novus Ordo, the mass that comes out of Vatican II, and they say, no, we'd like to keep doing the sacraments as they were before Vatican II. And there are legitimate groups in the church that do this. There are groups that say, we're going to dedicate ourselves entirely to the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite. What the SSPX does that gets them in trouble is there were some consecrations of bishops that were not permitted by Rome. And so the leader, the founder of SSPX, gets excommunicated, and it becomes a whole mess. And so today, the SSPX is what we would call canonically irregular. They're not quite in schism, but they're also not totally in full communion with the church. There are groups like the FSSP or the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest that are very in communion with the church. They're totally in line with the church. The SSPX is a little bit hazier, But again, this can get complicated, so we'd have to save that for our own episode, for its own episode. It's worth noting, though, that the SSPX is not Sedevacantist. They reject the Novus Ordo. They reject the New Mass. They have a lot of problems with the teachings found in the Second Vatican Council. They probably have a lot of problems with some of the things that the popes since Vatican II have said. But even today, the SSPX believes that Francis is the Pope. So eventually, Dave Bawden and his family are going to become Sedevacantists, but they didn't start there. So even when they were attending SSPX chapels, they were not yet Sedevacantists. At least the SSPX is not. And so Dave begins attending an SSPX seminary in Switzerland, as well as one in Michigan. But he was dismissed from formation in 1978. So before he's ordained, he's asked to leave the seminary. And that's kind of where the story is. We don't know much about what he did between his dismissal from seminary in 1978 and his election as Pope in 1990. But what's he been up to since then? Well, on December 11th, 2011, he was ordained by a rogue independent Catholic bishop. And that might raise a whole bunch of questions right there. So let's work backwards here. A rogue independent Catholic bishop, what the heck does that mean? Well, this is what's known as an episcopus vagans, which means basically wandering bishop. This is a situation that happens sometimes, more often with priests than with bishops, but it's when you have somebody who is a validly elected or validly ordained member of the clergy who is, for one reason or another, outside of the structures of canon law. So typically, when a priest is ordained as a priest, he's incarnated into a diocese or religious order. Basically saying, like, so when a priest is ordained, he is a member of that diocese. He's under the authority of that diocesan bishop. From a canon law perspective, like, that is his bishop. It's possible for him to be excardinated and move to another diocese. But from the moment he's ordained, he kind of fits into the structures of canon law. Same with bishops. They're assigned by the Pope to have a particular assignment, whether that's as the ordinary of a diocese or maybe as an auxiliary bishop, but they're in the system, you know? Well, what happens is you also have a group of clergy who are validly ordained, and yet for one reason or another find themselves outside of that system, usually because of an act of schism or excommunication. And so you have groups out there that claim to be Catholic that aren't, that find themselves out of communion with the church for one reason or another. So we think of groups like the Old Catholics, who, even though they have Catholic in their name, they actually separated after the First Vatican Council. You have communities out there that call themselves Catholic churches that are not in union with the church. And if you were to ask the local diocese about, hey, there's this Catholic church on this street in this town, they'll say, no, there isn't. And this is a big problem. We could do a whole episode, probably a whole series of episodes on groups that separate from the church and yet keep the name Catholic. And so what makes these rogue bishops interesting is they do have valid orders, meaning we believe they are legitimate bishops, which means they are able to celebrate valid sacraments. When it comes to bishops, a bishop can always validly ordain. And so we would say that these ordinations are illicit because if you have a member of the clergy who is excommunicated, they're not allowed to celebrate sacraments publicly. And so it's certainly against the law for these rogue bishops to ordain priests. And yet we would still say, in most cases, those ordinations are valid. So you have a valid bishop who's creating valid priests who can validly celebrate sacraments, and it's all happening against the law. So certainly not a good situation, but we would look at the ordination of Pope Michael on December 11th and say, so he was ordained deacon, priest, and bishop all on the same day. We would probably say that that's valid. Certainly not a great situation, certainly against canon law, and yet assuming that the bishop who ordained him is a valid bishop, and assuming everything was done in a valid way, we would have to say, yeah, he's actually a bishop. Not within the structures of canon law, but yeah, he was ordained. Well, next you might say, hold on, 2011, that's like 20 years after he was elected as the Pope. How can you be the Bishop of Rome for 20 years as a layman in Kansas? Well, if you ask Pope Michael, he will explain that the election of a pope is valid as long as the candidate is able, or as long as the candidate is valid, the election is valid. In other words, as long as the candidate is able to become a bishop, even if they're not presently a bishop, it is a valid election. And so he would say, I'm an unmarried man who is not a heretic, at least in his understanding. And so he would say, that means I'm a valid candidate for pope. That means that when I was elected by this conclave, I became the pope, even though I wasn't yet a bishop. And I think he's right about that. Of course, we're going to say that this was not a real conclave because of many reasons. But I think that part is correct, that if a conclave elects somebody who is not yet a bishop, as long as they're a valid candidate, it's a valid election. So, what has Pope Michael been up to since 1990? Well, obviously he claims to be the Pope. He claims to be the real Pope. He says, I'm the real head of the Catholic Church. I'm the real Bishop of Rome. I'm not able to live in Rome right now because somebody is in my chair, but he does believe that he's the real Pope. He dresses like the Pope. He wears the white soutane. He runs a website called Vatican in Exile, as well as a YouTube channel. And as far as I know, that's about it. He lives with his mom in Kansas. In 2009, a filmmaking crew was making a feature-length documentary about him. In that documentary, he says that he has about 30 solid followers. Now, that was in 2009. Who knows what's happened since then? But yeah, it seems like most of his ministry is making YouTube videos. It's kind of hard to tell. There isn't honestly much out there. But yes, that's Pope Michael for you. At least that's the guy in Kansas named Dave who wants you to call him Pope Michael. So now let's respond to some of these claims. Let's start with Sedevacantism. Remember, the argument there was that a heretic resigns office. All the bishops since Vatican II have been heretics, therefore there's been no pope. Now, it is true that a formal heretic will, by default, forfeit any ecclesiastical office he has. Here's the thing that most Sedevacantists don't get into, though. What is heresy? If you ask most Sedevacantists, it's anything I don't like, or anything that they find problematic, anything that is ambiguous or sounds like it could be modernist. Now, if you actually look at the definition of heresy, it is the obstinate post-baptismal denial of a truth which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith. So it has to be obstinate, right? It has to be a heresy that it's a denial of a truth, and it is persistent, that when it is brought to the attention of the person who said it, they stand by it. They say, no, this is what I mean to say, and I'm not taking this back. And this is the important part here. It's not only the denial of a truth, even a truth of the faith, it's the denial of an article of faith, something that the church has proposed definitively for belief. Now, there are many different types of assent to the beliefs in the church. There are things that we should accept, and then there are things that we must accept. And so when we talk about the definition of heresy, that's referring to those truths which must be accepted to be Catholic. And we could also get into the distinction between a formal and a material heretic. So even if you have somebody who commits a heresy, who says, let's just take the example, you have a theology professor who denies that Jesus is divine. Well, that is a heresy. And so at that point, we have the material of heresy there. We have material heresy. But it only becomes formal heresy when that theology professor is contacted by his bishop, who tries to correct it. And when that professor stands by it and says, no, I'm going to continue to maintain this belief. Now, that idea that Jesus is God, kind of important. That is an article of faith. And so at that point, that professor could be declared as a formal heretic. But it's going to be a very specific thing. It can't just be, oh, they said something that sounded kind of off. When we actually look at what popes have said, both before and after Vatican II, we don't have examples of popes who obstinately deny a truth which must be believed. Now, does this mean that the popes always say and do the best thing? Of course not. There are so many examples, especially from this pontificate, where you can look at something that the pope says or does, and you can legitimately question it and say, that seems weird. And that's okay. The problem with Sedevacantists is they will say, the Pope said something problematic, therefore he's a heretic, therefore he's not the real Pope. So that's one of the problems with this, is Sedevacantists don't typically have a good understanding of what actually constitutes heresy. And so their second premise kind of falls apart, the idea that all popes since John the 23rd have been heretics. Not really, at least not in the sense that would be required to say that those popes forfeited office. What's another problem with Sedevacantism? Well, practically, if this were true, that means that the average Catholic can't trust the church. When Christ made the church, he made it with a visible unity. He made it to lead the faithful, to guide the faithful. If it were the case that, hey, I know it looks like there's a pope, but he's secretly not the pope, the real pope is in Kansas, that would be incredibly confusing for the majority of Catholics. That doesn't seem to be something that would fit Christ's promise, especially if you have the claim that all the popes, all the bishops since Vatican II have been heretics. That also seems to go against Christ's promise that the gates of hell won't prevail against the church. So I'm not saying there won't be confusion in the church sometimes, and there will be a future episode about that. But if you're going to say that all of the popes and all of the bishops are actually secretly heretics and not real bishops and popes, that does seem to go against what Christ said about the church. So Sedevacantism doesn't work for a few reasons. What about Pope Michael specifically? Well, his reasoning about the validity of his conclave contains a false premise. So if you remember, he said that his conclave was valid because the church can always provide itself with a ruler, and he uses the principle first in time, first in right, to say that we were the first ones to hold a conclave, therefore I'm it. One of the problems that's behind his argument is this idea that, as with many Sedevacantist groups, the idea that every bishop who signed the documents of Vatican II was therefore a formal heretic and therefore forfeited office. Even if, and I'm just going to go based on his understanding, we're going to say even if that is the case, even if you wanted to grant that, okay, yeah, there are no more cardinals, there were many different traditionalist Sedevacantist bishops out there who would have more of a right to participate in conclave than a random group of 6 laymen in Kansas. And so, if they didn't believe that, why did they send out all these hundreds of information packets, which, for the record, most didn't respond and the rest said no. But it hardly seems authoritative to have a conclave of 6 lay people, even if you're going to admit that all of the quote-unquote Catholic bishops in the world are actually invalid. Pope Michael believed that there were valid bishops out there. He tried to get them to Kansas. And so it hardly seems authoritative to say, well, they just couldn't make it that day, but we were there, so we did it anyway. One common question that comes up with Pope Michael, is he delusional? Honestly, I don't think so. I do think that his reasoning is flawed, as we pointed out. I think that he makes some errors in his logic, but he does seem to be reasonable. He does seem to follow logic, at least a flawed logic. If he was delusional, That would be him saying, I'm the Pope because the Holy Spirit told me to, or told me that I was. He never says that. He never says that, it was a divine revelation. He lays out an argument for why his election was valid. It's not a good argument, but I don't think he's delusional. All right, so what's our takeaway here? Well, Jesus gives us the church to be the sacrament of salvation, this outward sign of an invisible reality. And that means that the visible unity of the church is very important. This is something that we talk about a lot in the church course. Jesus is not trying to trick us. He promises that the gates of hell won't prevail against the church. In other words, he promises that the church won't fail. And so he's not trying to trick us into, I know that every single bishop you've ever met looked like a bishop, but technically they were all fake. The real bishops were secret. You didn't know about them. Even though individuals in the church may be wrong, Jesus says the church itself will never fail. And so our takeaway here, we should trust in that promise. We should trust that no matter what, we can rely on the church because it is the body of Christ. It is not going to 100% fall into heresy because that would be the gates of hell prevailing, and Jesus said that won't happen. So, what resources can I offer you this week if you're interested in learning more about this? Well, first of all, in the show notes, you'll have a link to that episode of the Gracious Guest podcast that I was on last week. I hope you give it a watch. I'll have a link to Vatican in Exile, which is Pope Michael's official website. And man, it's a hoot. Most of the information about why he thinks he's the Pope I got from their frequently asked questions. I'm going to have a link to Pope Michael, which is a 2010 documentary about Pope Michael. And the thing I like about it is I can't tell. I've seen it a few times now, and I can't tell whether the people who made the documentary support Pope Michael or not. Half the time it feels like it's all tongue-in-cheek and they're just making fun of this random guy in Kansas. But the other half, it seems very genuine. And so I honestly can't tell. I'm sure if I did more research, I would know. But just from watching the documentary, I can't tell how they feel about Pope Michael, which I think makes it a good documentary. I'm going to have two different links to resources on Sedevacantism. One of them is a Catholic Answers video where Jimmy Akin takes a call about Sedevacantism, and the other is an episode of the Council of Trent, which is run by Trent Horn, who works for Catholic Answers as well. And then finally, I'm going to have a link to a selection of Eye of the Tiber articles about Pope Michael. Eye of the Tiber is a Catholic satire site, kind of like The Onion, but they really love this guy, or at least they love to write satirical articles about him, so check those out. As always, thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Remember to subscribe to Bonus Points wherever you listen to podcasts. Share this episode with somebody you think would enjoy it. Share the show with somebody you think would enjoy it. Make sure you check out our website, bonuspointspodcast.com, and especially make sure you get some questions in for the next episode of Question and Astle. In the meantime, that's all I have for you this week. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Bonus Points, where we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond.